Hello, today we're going to talk about President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was president from 1963 to 1969. And he took over for John F. Kennedy as president when he was his vice president. And so we're going to talk a lot about some aspects of his presidency, but I'm going to actually pull out a lot of things related to Vietnam and do a separate video there. So I'll make some references here, but we'll have a separate one that goes into a lot more detail about the ins and outs of both domestic and foreign policy related to that soon. But let's talk a little bit about Johnson. So keep in mind the time when he is president is a period of tremendous tumult. Vietnam, plus you have domestic unrest going on. And his reputation has gone through major swings. For many years after 1968, he is hated. There's no positive analysis of him at all. And his major legacy was all about Vietnam. He is going to, that's going to change dramatically when people look back at the Great Society and it gets a new look at. And programs are very impressive. They continue today, things like Medicare and Medicaid, and Vietnam becomes overshadowed, is going to overshadow that. But people continue to now look back at the Great Society. Plus, he becomes a model of how things can work. He was a successful legislator. He knew the art of politics in a way that seems almost impossible today. He was an insider's insider, a master of the Senate. He knew what it was going to take to get the bill passed. And honestly, Congress was his true love. The legislative branch was where the problems of the nation were solved. And so he gets to Washington in the 1930s and organizes a Congress of staffers from other offices. He's going to run the National Youth Administration in Texas, be elected to the House, be elected to the Senate, serve as a Senate minority and majority leader. While in the Senate, he's going to learn skill building to build a coalition, such as what he's going to do for civil rights and military spending. And there's two things he learns in Congress. One is the issue that he's kind of caught in the middle with the split that's happening in the party between the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, and the more Northern, more moderates. And he also believes liberalism is weaker in the US than most Democrats believe. And he's worried about the power of conservatives. And so he's always kind of worried about looking too weak as against communism. And in 1960, Kennedy runs, doesn't really like LBJ, sees him as kind of crass, undereducated, doesn't really trust him, but he was power hungry. And LBJ honestly didn't like JFK because he saw him as too inexperienced. However, LBJ's commanding presence in the South, particularly with experience, is going to be something that Kennedy will want. Well, LBJ actually hates being vice president, but it was the best option at the time. He didn't have anything to create excitement. There just was nothing really there. There were many Northerners who didn't want a Southerner at the top of the ticket. And his years spent as a vice president were honestly very frustrating. He wasn't involved in the inner circle because of the lack of trust. There's not really very many relevant moments. And he feels like he's sitting by in key moments in history, to be honest. But then he becomes president, and the shock of the assassination is immense. There's fears of, in Texas, there's a toxic atmosphere that's going on, and he quickly understands his responsibility. And his concerns are, number one, how to create a sense of calm and get the country through the tragedy that's going on. And number two, how to make himself the legitimate leader and tackle issues that have been building up that he wanted to move fast on. So I imagine that this is a problem that all individuals who become president after an assassination or death of their previous leader, or in the case of Ford as well, when he becomes president after Nixon resigns, is how do you shift to now I'm the legitimate leader, take me seriously, when they were only the vice president before. So the night after he becomes president, he maps out a schedule to pay attention to all things he wants to get done in the time that he has left. He tells his advisors that they have at most until the 1966 midterms if they can get elected in 1964. And so we have some things I'm going to come back to as far as the Great Society and talk about that in a minute. But he's very much a New Deal Democrat. He's loyal to FDR, believes that government is good. He's going to tackle issues of poverty, education, and civil rights that were not in the New Deal, but he felt should be. And in 1964, he's going to run for election for the first time on his own specifically. And he's going to run against an individual by the name of Barry Goldwater, who is the Republican nominee from Arizona. And he's really upset at the way he sees the Republican Party being too liberal. And he's against federal income taxes, he's against Social Security, against civil rights, he's against the nuclear test ban treaty, he thinks government's too involved. And so you can look at Barry Goldwater as kind of the father of modern conservatism. And so he's going to run, and JFK is not JFK, sorry, LBJ, we have here right now. He is going to put out an ad, which I'm going to show you on the next, here in a minute, in which he's going to paint Barry Goldwater as so hardcore crazy, basically, that he would start a nuclear war. And this advertisement I'm going to show you here aired only once, but it was once enough that it allowed LBJ to win in a landslide. Even though he wins in this landslide, he still feels like he's an illegitimate president. And there's concern over getting support in Congress for his agenda. Well, Goldwater was far right on social safety net. He voted against Civil Rights Act. He makes the comparison between Medicare and socialism. He's opposed to almost everything the government does, including the Tennessee Valley Authority. And there's a question in the GOP of whether a true conservative can win a national campaign. Goldwater's campaign is disorganized. He constantly says the wrong thing. And then we have this Daisy ad. So I'm going to show that for you now.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Zero.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Okay, and again, that only airs once, but it was enough. LBJ is going to win 44 states plus DC, 60% of the popular vote. The Democrats will win 68 to 32 seats in the Senate and have a majority in the House as well, with 295 to 140. You are going to see a shift from Southern Democrats to more liberals in there, and the Republicans are going to be in a mood to compromise because they didn't want to look like Goldwater because of this ad. And so in 1965, his top advisors are saying, let's pull back, but LBJ is looking for a different direction. He doesn't want to lose credibility internationally, personally, etc. And so then he's going to accomplish several different things throughout the 60s and throughout his time in this. And we're going to go over that on another slide. But then it gets to 1968. And 1968 is a very bad year in America. And I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. But so he could have run for election again because he'd served less than 2 years of JFK's term, which meant he would technically have been eligible for 10 years. However, he decides not to run for re-election. And to a lot of people, this looks like he's giving up. Like the president of the United States doesn't even have faith in us or in this war. And it's a bad year for America, as I mentioned. So let's move on to the next thing, foreign policy. So we have the domino theory, and LBJ is going to bring up this new term that says that if one nation falls to communism, they will all fall. And this is really the theory that's going to dictate so much of American foreign policy throughout the 60s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, is our need to make sure that no more countries fall to communism. He's going to escalate the Vietnam War. That is really his legacy. Even though other presidents will become involved in the Vietnam War, he is the one that ultimately sends troops. And So in 1963, there were just 16,000 military advisors. In 1965, there were 180,000 Americans, and by 1967, there are 500,000 Americans in Vietnam. So he truly is in charge of the escalation. You have the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is going to get us involved in the war. I'll talk about that in another video. The My Lai Massacre, which is going to lead to the 500 plus villagers being shot by American soldiers, which I will also talk about later, as well as the Tet Offensive, which was a surprise attack on the Lunar New Year against Americans in Vietnam, which again, I will talk about in the Vietnam video. So in 1964, though, he does sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where nations agree not to develop more nuclear weapons. Then in 1965, Sukarno versus Suharto. I know it's going to be hard to remember those two and which is which, but Sukarno was the leader of Indonesia. And he had become the first president after they had overthrown the Dutch. And he is going to become more left-leaning and eventually provide support and protection to the Communist Party of Indonesia. He will begin to make foreign policy decisions aided by the Soviets and China, which makes him look like he's on that side. He's a communist. So he will be replaced by Army General Suharto, who will then lead probably one of the worst massacres in Asian history, in that part of the world anyway. And he will rule with the support of the United States until 1998. And the sad thing is that U.S. authorities knew what was going on, but remained silent, and more information came out well after the time period. But ultimately, Suharto, when he comes in, he's very anti-communist. He's going to lead a mass purge of anyone suspected of being a communist or left-leaning, and it will lead to somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million dead in this massacre of that time period. So not our best foreign policy decision. But one of the patterns I've told you before to look for is how we saw the world so black and white that communists were bad no matter what they believed in, and no matter who else we replaced them with. Now, moving on to domestic policy, Johnson is a devoted follower of FDR's New Deal, as I previously mentioned, and he's going to create what's known as the war on poverty. He's going to see how many people are below the poverty line and decide that something really needs to be done about this. And when he comes up with his program called the Great Society, which is very much New Deal style, it included economic and welfare measures. And it's inspired by a book that he read in which 20% of the United States lived in poverty and 40% of all African Americans lived in poverty. So this program is going to include a number of things which are still in play today, including Medicare and Medicaid. So Medicare is health insurance, healthcare program for anyone who's retired. In fact, it's the only healthcare program that you can get if you are over the age of 65 and retired. Medicaid is the same type of program, but it is geared for those that are in poverty, that do not have enough money and maybe don't have private health insurance of their own. He also establishes the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which includes things like Head Start, which was for preschools for the disadvantaged children, to try to get them up to the same level as children who maybe did get the opportunity to go to preschool. In fact, he's going to also make sure that this act here is the funds primarily primary and secondary education. It's reauthorized every 5 years. He is going to pass some clean air and clean water laws, automobile regulation, consumer protection laws, things like chemicals and credit disclosures must be done. He's going to help with public broadcasting, creation of the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities programs. And then he's also going to create the Immigration Act of 1965, which, if you recall, the program that had been in place since the 1920s had been a quota program where only a certain number of people from each country were allowed in. Well, he's going to discontinue the national origin system there. And what he's going to do is a new policy that is first come, first serve. And so like immigrants with families will be able to come first. Immigrants with certain skills, immigrants seeking asylum from other nations. And then he also creates the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which spends $2.9 billion for urban renewal and creates approximately 240,000 housing units for lower income individuals. So his Great Society program is extremely successful, and it could have continued on had it not been for Vietnam, because Vietnam just overshadowed it completely and took up so much of the energy with it. Now, I mentioned previously that 1968 is a very bad year. So we have the Tet Offensive, which makes Americans basically realize that the war is not going as well as we'd been told it had, because ultimately it's a defeat for the Americans, and the public sees this, and they just realize that the government's been lying to them. Then we have the My Lai massacre I already mentioned. In addition, you have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which sets off riots in many places around the United States. You have the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who was the brother of John F. Kennedy, who was running for president. And he was in California the day of the California primary. He went to the Ambassador Hotel and was going to be giving a speech. And he was then led through the kitchen where he was assassinated. And again, this just set off so much despair in the country of, now what do we do? And then because neither Johnson had not run for re-election and the front runner Kennedy had been killed, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago is just a total disaster, because inside they're fighting over who's going to be the nominee, which ultimately was Hubert Humphrey. And outside you've got Vietnam War protests. So we think of 2020, I'm sure when we look back, we're going to look at that as that was a really bad year. Well, 1968 was one of those kind of years that we know what it felt like, right? So one of the things that I mentioned previously is that we have just a couple of chief justices who are so influential. They have an entire court named after them, an era. And the first one was the Marshall Court that we talked about under Jefferson and beginning in that time. And so the Warren Court, several very important court cases that we're going to discuss here. And we'll come back to these as well. But Brown versus Education is the one that ends segregation in public schools. And we will talk about this a lot more detail when we get to activism. Yates versus Yates versus the United States in 1957 says the First Amendment protects radical or reactionary speech unless it poses a clear and present danger. Mapp versus Ohio says that illegally obtained evidence cannot be used in court. Engel versus Vitale is an important one with freedom of religion. It says that the state-sponsored recitation of prayer in public schools is not allowed. So basically it bans school prayer, meaning that we cannot have an organized school prayer. We used to start most schools with the Lord's Prayer in the morning, along with the Pledge of Allegiance. And they say you can't do that anymore because it favors one particular religion. And it also gives the impression that the government is facilitating this religion. Gideon versus Wainwright ordered states to provide lawyers to those who cannot afford them in criminal proceedings. So this was the rights of the accused, as was Escobedo versus Illinois, which said that criminal suspects have the right to counsel during police interrogations under the Sixth Amendment. And I'm going to skip ahead for a second there to Miranda versus Arizona, which is another one that dealt with the rights of the accused, a very, very important case, out of which we get the Miranda rights, which are the idea that the police has to say to you, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed for you, etc. And then the last one, Griswold versus Connecticut, deals with right to privacy. It overturned a law that prevented Planned Parenthood from giving married persons information or medical advice on how to prevent conception. So it declared bans on contraception by states very unconstitutional. So there was a lot of restrictions even among married couples with what they were allowed and not allowed to do. So this goes to the issue of the right to privacy. And so these were the main court cases of this time period. And so ultimately, the legacy of LBJ was that he provided help for the poor, for the ill-educated, for minorities. He had a lot of success comparative to the New Deal. He reduced the poverty rate. Medicare, which reduced poverty for the elderly, is still something that's in existence today, and it's a vital program for the United States, particularly for seniors, because they have no other healthcare option at this moment. Head Start is going to improve the performance of students, and there will be no president since Lincoln who had worked harder for civil rights. And again, we'll come back to the civil rights ultimately later, But you should know that despite his foreign policy, which again, we're going to talk about Vietnam separately, he ultimately does have a very successful domestic policy. And that's one of the things you see with a lot of presidents is they are strong in one area or the other. You usually don't see a president who just has two amazing domestic policy and foreign policy. And certainly when we look at Johnson, we would say that domestic policy was his strong suit. And that is all. Thank you.